A genre of game that I really love but don't talk about as often as some of my other favorites are 3D platformers. I grew up playing stuff like Banjo-Kazooie, Mario Sunshine, Sonic Adventure, Crash Bandicoot, and The Wrath of Cortex. You get the idea. It's a genre that's been very near and dear to me since I was a kid, but it's also one I haven't really explored all that deeply if I'm being honest. Like, I play all the new Mario and Sonics that come out, and a few indie ones like Hat in Time and Yooka-Laylee, but I've neglected a huge chunk of the history of the genre since I just never really checked on the PlayStation side of platformers due to me not owning one as a kid. Well, beyond Crash Bandicoot, of course, which I got extremely into a few years back after playing Wrath of Cortex as a kid, but, you know, that's different. So that being said, I decided to start trying to change that a bit and play the original Ratchet and Clank for the PlayStation 2. To give a brief summary of it, Ratchet and Clank was a game made by Insomniac Games as a new IP for the next generation of hardware after the genre-defining Spyro the Dragon games on the PSX. If you were wondering where you heard the name Insomniac from, that's probably it if you're a bit older, or if you're not as big of a nerd as me or younger and don't look up what old games the studio made before playing something, you may just know them from their work on games such as Sunset Overdrive or Spider-Man PS4. The game had a pretty interesting development history in my opinion, starting as a project codenamed I-5 before it was ultimately restarted due to a lack of interest from most of the team. The game was then retooled based on some ideas from writer Brian Hastings and eventually shifted into the Ratchet and Clank that we got today. To me, that's not the interesting part though. No, what I found fascinating was that shortly after the game got rebranded into Ratchet and Clank, the studio Naughty Dog, who you may know from their work on the original Crash Bandicoot trilogy, Jak and Daxter, Uncharted, The Last of Us, and their insane, even by industry standards, levels of crunch, approached Insomniac and offered to let them use some of their tech that they had developed for Jak and Daxter, as long as Insomniac agreed to share any improvements they made on the software with Naughty Dog. I just found this kind of neat since both studios were working closely with Sony at the time, and the idea of these studios that were kind of tangentially related just sharing tech between themselves so more advanced games could be made is cool in my opinion. That tangent aside, I am very curious to see how Ratchet and Clank is as a game. I've heard a lot of love for the series, and it's one of Sony's few IPs from the early eras that still exists and actively continues, so I'm really excited to see where it began. So before I can go off on another aside, why don't we get to talking about the actual game? Like normal, I'm going to be spoiling the game, so if you care about that, I suggest pausing things here and going to play the game yourself, but if not, sit back and relax. As always, I'm Jay, and let's talk about Ratchet and Clank. Our story starts with us being introduced to Ratchet, a young Lombox from the planet Veldin who is trying to build a spaceship to get himself off his backwater planet that he's been, stuck on for his entire life. Unfortunately, he can't finish his ship and leave without a robot system made specifically for starting the engines on it. Luckily for him, across the galaxy, an evil robot manufacturing plant run by a douchebag CEO named Drek had a malfunction and made Clank. Clank is a small bot who, upon his birth, instantly sees a video of his creator wanting to destroy planets in order to build a new one for his people after they polluted their planet to the point of it being uninhabitable. The malfunction that created Clank also gave him a conscience, so he decides to try and track down a superhero called Captain Quark in order to put a stop to Drek. The other robots from Drek's factory give chase and shoot down the ship Clank stole over Veldin, causing him to crash near Ratchet. This gives Ratchet a way off that rock and also gives Clank someone to help him reach Captain Quark. Ratchet doesn't really care about the potential death of multiple planets and people though, and more just wants to get off his planet and have some fun. After flying the ship for the first time, they arrive where Clank believes Captain Quark is by Ratchet crashing their ship into a mountain. Here they save the planetary chairman and get given info about where Quark actually is, which is an entirely different planet. They get given a ship, and after a while of chasing around the good captain, it's revealed that he's actually in league with Drek, being paid to essentially be a spokesperson for his new planet project instead of the hero he pretends to be. After a few planets worth of Ratchet and Clank screwing things up for him, Drek commands Quark to find and kill them. Quark doesn't have to work too hard though, since Ratchet and Clank catch up to him themselves on the planet Ralgar. Ratchet and Clank follow him to his secret hideout on the planet Umbris, where Quark betrays him and makes him fight a Blargarian Snagglebeast. This betrayal enrages Ratchet, who has just kind of been following along with Clank's goal because Clank kind of kept convincing him to come along, and now has his own reason for wanting to continue this journey. That reason being cold-blooded revenge murder. Ratchet and Clank have an argument about this, with Ratchet getting particularly nasty, but he kinda can't leave without Clank to pilot the ship. They uneasily travel to a few more planets and save some more people from Drek's forces, learning that he's gearing up to rip apart another planet using the Planet Buster Maximus. The duo stop the Planet Buster and move on to one of Drek's main bases in order to try and take out Quark, who they've tracked there. The two of them shoot down Quark in a space dogfight, and they watch an info bot showing the destruction of a city on a nearby planet at the hands of Drek. Seeing the horrors of war up close like this, Ratchet kinda realizes how selfish and uncaring he's been, and he decides to make up with Clank. Clank. Both of them are now fully committed to stopping Drek after this little conversation they have. After visiting a few more planets and revisiting a few others in a mad dash to disrupt as much of Drek's forces as possible, the two learn from Clank's mom that Drek has gone to Ratchet's home of Veldin to try and destroy it, using his new machine known as the Deplanetizer in order to get the perfect orbit for his new Franken planet. The two of them race through Drek's fleet in order to get back to Veldin to stop Drek once and for all. They manage to defeat him and turn around the Deplanetizer just in time to destroy Drek's patchwork planet instead of Veldin. The two then share a touching moment after everything is all said and done and go home together. I honestly really like the story of Ratchet and Clank. It's a pretty straightforward story, but the way it's told is really effective in my opinion. It has a perfect balance of serious and silly moments in my opinion. I think that the overall core of the game, Ratchet and Clank, really get to shine. Ratchet has this whole arc about going from a selfish, uncaring person who in his first encounters with Clank doesn't care about him beyond being able to use him to leave his home planet, and he then turned into someone who, while still a little brass, does care about the greater good and wants to legitimately help stop the person who's trying to change the galaxy for the worse. It's really interesting to me because it's not often that you see a kid's game where the main character is actively just a dick for most of the game and has to slowly become a better person through the experiences he has as he travels through the world. It's a great arc that I was honestly not expecting for this game, and I think it's exemplified by how it contrasts with Quark, who from the start of the game is in the eyes of the people in the universe a morally good, upstanding hero who just wants to help the populace. And then the entire game shows him getting more and more evil and doing worse things because he just cares about himself and getting richer. It's a great dichotomy and I really enjoy watching it play out throughout the game. I also really found it interesting how they had Clank function as Ratchet's conscience for the entire game, but he basically just ignored Clank until he could fully see the consequences of him not caring about what was going on around him. It makes for extremely solid character dynamics and it works really well in my opinion. It made me feel really compelled by Ratchet as a character, and I don't really think that would have worked as well if Clank wasn't there kind of like pushing back against him throughout the entire game. It's always cool to see games I didn't expect much from story-wise have something like this going on. It should be obvious, but I really enjoyed the story on display here. It makes me both excited and apprehensive to play the sequel since I both want to see how they follow up on Ratchet's character here, while also being honestly kind of worried that they may not be able to give him a character arc as good as this one in the next one. Time will tell, but we'll find out when I get there eventually. For now though, why don't we talk about this game's gameplay? When it comes to gameplay, Ratchet and Clank is an action platformer. Basically what that means is that it plays like a traditional platformer, kind of like, say Mario 64 or Crash Bandicoot, but they have an extended focus on combat compared to games like those. We'll talk about the action part of the genre title in a second, but I just wanted to start this off by saying that I really like the general feel of movement in this game. Ratchet feels really solid to control, and the general platforming feels really well done. That being said, it did take me weirdly long to adjust to certain movement changes, like when you get to hover with Clank. It's not outright bad, but trying to adjust to how it works took me longer than it normally does in games like this, which felt kind of weird. Basically, once you get the hover, it just kind of changes how you jump. So instead of doing a double jump, you double jump and then hold, and it just doesn't like hover how other games do. It felt kind of weird and took me a while to get used to. Overall though, other than that little complaint, it's just generally a really fun core movement loop in my opinion. On top of the platforming and the combat, the game also has a few mini games it throws in to spice things up a bit. There aren't a lot, but there is enough to make it feel at least a little varied. The two that I remembered most vividly were hoverboard racing and these little laser puzzles to unlock certain doors. Hoverboard racing is basically just, a racing mini game where you ride a hoverboard around a track with boost pads until you get in first and win by the third lap. It's alright. It doesn't stand out insanely well, but it's fun enough. I did like the little laser puzzles a fair bit though. They got pretty creative by the end, and I liked them as a fun little breaks from the constant running and gunning of the main gameplay loop. The core of Ratchet and Clank though is the combat that I haven't talked about until now. You have a huge variety of different weapons you can purchase using the bolts you collect throughout the levels in order to tackle the various enemies you encounter. It's pretty impressive how each weapon in the game feels different from one another to me. Like generally when you have a roster of weapons as big as this game, they start to kind of blend together after a point, so each one having a unique feeling to it is pretty nice even if they fall into certain categories. I tended to go for a few particular weapons for certain enemies more than others, but everything is pretty viable throughout the entire game I felt. I think there was a good balance of weapons without any particular one that I got feeling more overpowered than the other. Like the standard blaster you get towards the start of the game is still a pretty useful tool at the end despite there being a multitude of other weapons introduced by that point. I did end up gravitating towards the Tesla Claw and the Glove of Doom a lot though. Both of these weapons were pretty good at clearing a room and just felt fun to use for a majority of fights. One aspect that I did dislike about the weapon system though was how using the weapon wheel felt like it was breaking the flow of gameplay whenever I'd bring it up. Like you'd have to stop in order to swap weapons from the wheel, and this would just leave you open to attack from enemies, which in itself is fine because there should be some risk to switching weapons up in combat, but the fact that it just brings you to a complete stop where you can't do anything walks a tightrope between good risk/ward mechanic idea to frustrating and kind of tedious once you get to sections that require you to switch quickly. I feel like if they just changed the way you open up the weapon wheel, this wouldn't be as big of an issue, but as it is right now, it just feels like it takes me out of it a bit to have to start and stop constantly as I'm trying to jump around and fight. While I'm complaining, I also felt like the way that the game handled checkpoints was less than great. In the later levels, if you died, you'd have to replay multiple different sections of the level again. I'm fine with games being challenging and needing you to redo parts of it if you die, but with Ratchet and Clank, it kind of felt like a sudden shift from pretty fair feeling checkpoints in the beginning to, hey, why don't you spend another 20 minutes doing this section again because you slipped up and got shot one too many times seconds before the last checkpoint. It's just kind of frustrating, and while it's not the worst thing in the world, it was annoying to have sections where the game just threw a ton at you out of nowhere after a long string of enemy encounters, and you had to do it all over again because you couldn't switch weapons fast enough or miss input and fell off the edge. This was especially prevalent in the battle against the final boss, where the first phase of the fight had a checkpoint and then every other phase after that doesn't. Like, I can kind of see the argument for why the first phase was a checkpointed since it was just a big set piece with a giant Clank, which I'll talk about later, but it felt weirdly inconsistent as to be able to skip that part of the fight again, but then you have to do everything else if you died. While on the subject of boss fights, they're alright. None of them stand out a ton other than the final boss, but they're there. Stuff like the Alien Queen or Captain Quark fight are fine, but they're not like standout boss experiences for me personally. The final fight against Drek was interesting in how it handled having multiple stages while incorporating all the different movement abilities you got throughout the game, but it was kind of dragged down by the checkpoint system I mentioned, just making the fight feel inconsistent. That being said, the final phase was pretty tough in an enjoyable way. It took me a while to get a hang of it, but once I got all of his attacks down and knew when to counterattack with each weapon, it became a breeze. If only it wasn't super tedious to get back there each time I died. I've been complaining for a minute now, but I do want to say that while I have my issues with it, the gameplay of Ratchet and Clank is still pretty solid overall. The combat is snappy, and blowing enemies apart with the various weapons the game gives you feels great in my opinion, and a lot of the one-off power-ups like the giant Clank I mentioned earlier feel nice in the moment, are used just enough to where they feel fleshed out but don't overstay their welcome. I just think that the issues of focus on hold it back just a bit. It's not a bad game by any means, just one that needs a few touches here and there to really find its voice, so to speak. Speaking of finding his voice, I'm going to use that sound-related phrase to segue into saying I was greatly impressed by this game's soundtrack. The way the composer for this game managed to arrange the songs so that while they were mostly mechanical sounding, they still had a magical feeling to them that was really interesting to me personally. To kind of explain better, they kept the sci-fi space aesthetic that the game was going for, while also managing to give a borderline mystical feeling to a number of the songs, which in my opinion made traveling to these alien worlds feel a little more adventurous. Like you were discovering something outside the scope of what you've seen before, just like Ratchet was when he stepped off his home planet for the first time, and I think that them managing to do that with the music is really cool. This is also notably inverted with the final boss theme that plays when you fight Drek. The sense of mysticism I'm talking about is still there, but it's kind of distorted, more sinister sounding as you battle to save Ratchet's home planet as it begins to be changed and torn apart. You're still getting that feeling of discovery that you got with every other planet, but this time around discovering how your home was being destroyed before your eyes. It's really cool how the music works in tandem with the game to make this moment more impactful, while still keeping the same kind of core idea a lot of the tracks throughout the game have been going for. It's a really solid soundtrack to listen to, but I think that these little thematic touches for the songs just elevate to an insane degree in my opinion. I'm really happy with how this game's soundtrack is, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to it in the background of this video so far. Definitely check it out on your own time if you get the chance. I think the thing that I found the most interesting about Ratchet and Clank is just how much of an encapsulation of that time period it is. What I mean by this is that back when the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox were coming out, there was a bit of a shift in the platformer genre. Studios no longer saw running and jumping around areas, bouncing into enemies, and collecting everything in sight really enough anymore since it's all been done already. So in order to try and keep the genre fresh, a lot of platformers became more action-oriented. Combat became a very important part of the mix for platformers from this point forward, and it had a lot of interesting results. Even the Super Mario game shook things up a bit by adding FLUDD into Mario Sunshine, which gave him new avenues to deal with enemies. It was a really interesting time because coming off of some highly regarded 3D platformers from the PSX, N64, and Dreamcast like Crash Bandicoot, Banjo-Kazooie, and Sonic Adventure, developers were really looking for ways to push the genre forward. And I think to a degree, this focus on combat was a smart direction to take it in some regards. Though I could have done without the collectathons of that generation almost completely dying out. Just a personal thing, but I really like those. Banjo-Kazooie was one of my favorite games of all time for a while. I think within this time sphere though, Ratchet and Clank stand out as a prime example of the shift. Though it does make sense in hindsight also, considering before Ratchet and Clank, Insomniac was famous for the Spyro the Dragon trilogy, which of the first generation of 3D consoles already stood out as the most action-oriented platformers on those systems. Comparing something like Spyro to Ratchet and Clank though, it is very clear just how much further they wanted to push the action angle for the series. And personally, I think it worked out. There's a really solid core here that, while not perfect, is a great evolution of what a lot of this game's predecessors had already done. I've always been a bigger fan of the more traditional style of platformer and collectathon, but I think this game really makes a case for action platformers in a way that other games from this era that I've tried, like the later Crash games, the PS2 Spyro games, and Jak and Daxter just really weren't able to. Speaking of Jak and Daxter, it's interesting seeing how much these two games diverge despite going for similar ideas only 1 year apart from each other. How they both even come from developers that had complete breakout hit platformers on the PlayStation, with Jak and Daxter being made by Naughty Dog, who I mentioned earlier were the developers of Crash Bandicoot. Not going to do a full compare and contrast here because I haven't finished Jak and Daxter, on top of that not being the topic of this video, but who knows, maybe I'll talk about it at a later date since playing Ratchet and Clank had made me curious to revisit that game. Regardless, I think the way that Insomniac Games managed to evolve the genre while keeping it similar in feel to the games that came before it is a large part of why I like this game. You can see where it came from while also seeing how it tries to evolve the genre, and I think that's really cool. I think it's probably one of the smoother transitions into the more action-oriented style platformer I've seen from a developer. Even if I like certain other games that could fit under this genre, like Mario Sunshine, more than, I like this game, I think this one definitely was a smoother transition for Insomniac than Sunshine was for Nintendo. I do kind of wonder if this is the same kind of shift can be seen in other genres, and now I'm kind of curious about that, honestly. But the important takeaway I have regarding this game is that I think it's really fascinating how you can see the paradigm shift regarding platformers with this game, and I don't really have much more to say about it. I just think that's really cool. So with that all the way, where does that leave Ratchet and Clank on the tier list? Well, I'd put it in B tier. I think right above Parasite Eve, but after Armored Core, it's a good place for it. I like the game a fair bit, and I think it's a great starting point for a new series. It has some issues that I talked about above, like the weapon wheel not feeling very intuitive, but overall, I had a good time with it. I think that hands down the best part of this game was easily seeing Ratchet and Clank both grow as characters. I'm not sure if it's just because the last 3 games I've played for this channel didn't have much in the way of character arcs, but it was really refreshing seeing the two of them grow and evolve as people over the course of the game. I'm both really excited and really curious to see where they go for the sequel, since it does kind of feel like they're at a weird juxtaposition. I'm not really sure where they can go with Ratchet character-wise since his arc is done, but at the same time I can see so many different ways the story could be improved. I can think of a few ways they can tackle both of these things, but it's interesting how I feel like both of these elements that I focus on so heavily are semi-opposites of each other and how I feel like they could tackle it for the next game. Despite this, I'm still very excited to see where Insomniac goes with the series for the next outing whenever I get around to it, and yeah, B-tier game, pretty good. And with that, that's all I really have to say about Ratchet and Clank. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Jay Talks About Games. I'm going to try and continue to upload new episodes every other Friday, so stay tuned for that if you like this episode. I'd definitely be here for the next one since that one's going to be special in my opinion. Beyond that, there's a few more things here on Disc 3 for my friends and I, which I'll have links to on the screen and in the description down below that I think are pretty worth the watch. Be sure to check those out if you enjoyed this since everyone has been working super hard on everything here. Speaking of, we are also looking to start streaming again soon, so be on the lookout for that as well. Otherwise, if you like this video, feel free to like and comment and, subscribe since that's the only way for YouTube's algorithm to notice smaller channels like ours. Regardless, I've been Jay, and thank you for listening to me talk about Ratchet and Clank. See y'all next time!